Okay. Um, so my presentation is titled Remembering the Past, Black Panther, Sovereignty, and the Cultural Politics of African Futurism. As the body of scholarship on Black Panther grows, the movie is being increasingly analyzed as a work of science fiction that imagines an alternative past for Africa in order to envision a radically different future. It's almost like an otherworldly, impossible to achieve in reality future, and that is why it has to be speculative. Um, in this presentation, however, I explore the ways in which Black Panther maximizes the many affordances of speculative fiction to recapture a past that is not merely alternative history. So I'm arguing that the past that we see in Black Panther is not just imagined history. Um, in my reading, the movie represents a true to life past in order to jolt our memory and to disrupt the hegemonic historiography that has conditioned how Africa's historicity is understood. Whereas Black Panther's portrayal of Wakanda, that's the fictional country in the movie, that was never colonized, is commonly interpreted as the movie engaging with a mythical memory. I argue that Black Panther actually depicts a historically accurate past, and even more so, it does that with the political imperative of remembering in the sense of to recall the past, but also to put together something that has been dismembered. So I'm using remembering in those two senses, remembering a history that has been dismembered by the epistemic violence engendered by global white supremacy. In his essay titled Memory, Truth, and Healing, Wole Soyinka ponders, how far back should memory reach? How deeply into the recesses of the past? The answer that springs spontaneously to mind is that memory is not governed by the statutes of limitations, and that collective memory, especially, is the very warp and weft of the tapestry of history that makes up society. Unravel and jettison a thread from that tapestry, and society itself may become undone at the seams. Much of modern global historiography has been constructed such that it is almost impossible to think of Africa outside the lenses of slavery and colonialism. Nevertheless, the fact remains that slavery and colonialism are not the only historical realities of Africa, nor should be the only paradigms for understanding the continent. But because hegemony and history are inextricably interwoven, the histories of slavery and colonialism have become the master narratives through which we contemplate Africa. As a cultural production, Black Panther dislodges these statues of limitation that Wole Soyinka refers which have confined the memory of Africa to 1619 and after. Definitely, we know that there was life in Africa before the European incursion. In fact, a lot of African scholars have countered the argument that the impacts of colonialism on Africa are irreversible. Oftentimes, scholars who align with this thinking believe that the few decades of European rule in Africa were a brief interlude when examined against the millennia of Africa's history. And they often conclude that we exaggerate the importance of colonialism because we are so close to it in time. The narrator in Black Panther tells us about millions of years ago, signaling from the very beginning that the movie invites us to contemplate Africa outside of the without taking recourse to the fatalistic logic of its colonial history. The movie is calling us to access in depth the recesses of the past, which Shoinka refers to. Therefore, the question that Black Panther seeks to answer is this: what happens if we think of Africa outside of its colonial history? Of course, the answer is not a simple one. It is as complex in temporality as it is in spatiality. And it is these spatial temporal complexities that the movie grapples with. Um, Black Panther also attempts to refocus the ways in which we remember the history of colonization itself. So, as opposed to the rhetoric that colonialism brought certain advantages to Africa, and there are people who would make that argument and point to what they consider the positive outcomes of colonialism. But what the movie does explicitly is to point out that the colonial project was a venture of exploitation through and through, nothing less and nothing more. The core of the conflict in Black Panther, much like the ontological conflict that has constituted the touchstone of Africa's history, is driven by the question of sovereignty. The sovereignty of Wakanda coalesces around vibranium, and vibranium is the meteorite that serves as the power base of the state. The contention in Wakanda stems from the external aggression that Wakanda experiences in the in Ulysses' Claw's attempts to get hold of vibranium, and by extension, the CIA, of course, is also after vibranium, and those two, I mean, Claw and the CIA are just metonyms of the West as a whole, and its search or exploitative search for African, both human and natural resources. The way Ulysses Claw is attracted to vibranium is the same way that Europe was drawn to the natural and human resources of Africa for exploitation. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon notes, in a very concrete way, Europe has stuffed itself inordinately with the gold and raw materials of colonial countries. And so vibranium is, on the one hand, that resource that powers much of the life and technoculture in Wakanda, but it is also an element of fantasy, being an extraterrestrial element that is the fantastic, but also fantasy in the sense that it is the object that tickles the fancy of the West. Vibranium is a representation of the rich natural and human resources of Africa that appeal to and fuel the exploitative instincts of Europe. Like Africa, like Wakanda, the very present threat that the West poses against Wakanda through the pursuit of vibranium as used to the imperialist impulse that animated the colonial project. Um, Because of Claw, Wakanda realizes that its autonomy is not as secure as it had imagined. You know, Wakanda is this country that is sealed off from the rest of the world, hiding in plain sight, as the narrator says. But because of the exploitative instincts of the West, it becomes vulnerable. The fact that Wakanda cannot hide in plain sight anymore and keep itself safe from the prying eyes of the West speaks to not only the far reaching impacts of colonialism, but also the ubiquity of modern world systems such as global capitalism and neoliberalism that worked hand in hand with colonial modernity. Seeing as Wakanda can no longer hide in plain sight from other nations, it becomes imperative for the nation to insert itself into global geopolitics. Today, Africa also does not have the luxury to hide from the nefarious impacts of colonialism, white supremacy, capitalist modernity, neoliberalism, and other such manifestations of Western hegemony that have been constructed to keep the continent subjugated. Now, I'm using the term African futurism, which is a term coined by the Nigerian writer called Nnedi Okorafor. So there's this move to kind of differentiate between African futurism and Afrofuturism. It's a sort of like a thin line, but I think there are some nuances there that are worth addressing. And because Afrofuturism has had to deal with a lot of critiques of it being Western oriented, and even the person who coined the term Afrofuturism is a white American. So there are a lot of conversations around Afrofuturism as a legitimate critique of conventional science fiction. Um, and so Nnedi Okorafor, for example, says that our work is African futurism, and she defines it. She says that it's different from Afrofuturism because its default is African. Put differently, African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism, but more deeply rooted in African culture, history, mythology, and point of view, as it then branches into the Black diaspora, and it does not privilege or center the West, as Hope Wabuke puts it. In my reading, the ultimate distinction between Afrofuturism and African futurism boils down to the latter's explicit politics of post-colonial critique. Um, Jessica Langer has pointed out that for a very long time, where there could have been post-colonial science fiction, there was instead a real or perceived science, a real or perceived silence. It is this void that African futurism seeks to fill, this post-colonial void. African futurism engages speculative fiction with an unambivalent aim of disrupting the epistemological structures upon which the history of colonialism and the present realities of neocolonialism subsist. Therefore, in my thinking, African futurism offers a scathing post-colonial counter-hegemonic critique of global modernity. In a book titled Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, um, Yatasha Womack notes that the fate of Black characters in sci-fi movies from the 50s through the 90s was always cast by default as dull. The Black characters in those films popped up as the silent, mystical type, or maybe a scary witch doctor, but it was fairly clear that in the artistic renderings of the future by pop culture standards, people of color weren't factors at all. Black Panther consciously speaks back to this tradition of sci-fi movies by contesting the stock portrait of Black people as objects rather than subjects who can participate in the project of futurity. Black Panther's political and cultural resistance to these portraits of Black subjectivity manifest in two ways. One, Black Panther contests science fiction speculation of the future by portraying Wakanda as the technological base of the world, not only in the present, but also in the future. Secondly, the movie's projection of the future is animated by a race conscious impulse. The future of Wakanda is neither post racial nor aracial. Much of traditional science fiction projects an aracial future, speculating forecasts of a utopian race-free future and pronouncements of the dystopian as the predominant discourses of blackness and technology in the public sphere. The vision of the future that we see in the universe of Black Panther is a far cry from a placeless, raceless, bodiless future, as Nelson puts it. The future in Black Panther does not discount the place of race, nor does it diminish the geographical situatedness of Africa and its place in the world. Um, Ultimately, Black Panther's oh, sorry, before I get to this slide. Whereas the technologically enabled future is by its very nature unmoored from the past and from the people of color, Black Panther emphasizes the inextricability of the past, the present, and the future from one another much like in the African cosmological apprehension of the fluidity of time. Black Panther reenacts how the present is shaped by the past and how the future only proceeds from that past, which is shaped by, um, sorry, I'll take that again. Black Panther reenacts how the present is shaped by the past and how the future only proceeds from that present, which is shaped by the past. Black Panther's cartography of temporality is consistent with African cosmology, another factor that characterizes African futurism. Ultimately, Black Panther's politics of futurity serves as an iconography of appreciating the multivalencies of global blackness. The future, as it were, is a blackness that successfully recoups its multiple consciousnesses. Du Bois used the term in the early 20th century of double consciousness, but Black Panther invites us to acknowledge that the future of blackness, especially global diasporic blackness, largely depends on how Black nations negotiate their sovereignties and the multiple layers of implications that that would have. In that light, the conflict between Killmonger and T'Challa, two major characters in the movie, is really a contemplation about the prospects and problematics of global Black solidarity, even if it seems on the surface to be a conflict of ideology and principle of whether Wakanda should be involved in global politics or not. So far, I've argued that Black Panther reconfigures historiographical memories about Africa by decentering the prominent role that colonialism has taken as a staple topos in prevalent contemplations of African history. Of course, the movie does not seek to write colonialism out of Africa's history. I need to stress that point. Um, I've shown how Wakanda, even though it's portrayed as an uncolonized nation, actually offers us allegorical testimonies of how colonialism upsets and continues to upset African countries. But what I'm saying is that Black Panther compels us as viewers to view the legacies of colonialism through a different critical epistemological lens. This form of looking back to recuperate the past is not just to conjure up alternative histories, as most scholarly criticism of Black Panther has argued. For me, the purpose is to nuance the way we remember, to remember, like I said, that's member, to remember marginalized histories that have been dismembered to suit imperial ends. But most importantly, it is that kind of nuanced remembrance of the past that I think can engender a profound imagination of the future. Thank you all for listening.